Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. And we have our Kickstarter campaign going. There's a link to it down there. So please pledge some money to Space Command so we can shoot more of it and you can be part of it in many, many, many ways. But beyond that, I wanted to talk about Chernobyl, which is a TV show on HBO that feels like science fiction because it's so horrific. It deals with a nuclear accident. It's a great show, if a depressing one. Wonderfully acted, wonderfully produced and directed and acted, of course. And but I wanted to talk about it in terms of another TV show that I just watched called Atomic Attack. Now, it's so interesting because we still have thousands of nuclear weapons in the world, and we have nuclear power plants, and at any point, any time, any city could be obliterated, and so that still is a threat. We don't think about it like we did when I was a kid, when we had the Cold War going, and you'd have drop drills where you have to drop under a desk, because of course a desk would save you from a nuclear explosion. No, it would not, but they didn't tell us that. But here's the cool part. And I want to talk about the history of science fiction and atomic power and the atomic bomb. And and in the light of Chernobyl, because Chernobyl, although it isn't science fiction, it feels like it. And I urge all of you to watch it. It's very interesting and horrific. And if Chernobyl hadn't happened, there's actually a science fiction novel. I had it. Oh, here it is. Is it Nerves? I think Nerves by Lester Del Rey. This is the British paperback edition. I believe it's about an accident in a nuclear power plant before that ever happened. Yes, the Nerves is the story of one day in such a plant, a day that begins in fear and tension and reaches its climax as men race against disaster in what may be the last day of their lives. So this is actually written before Chernobyl, before 3 Mile Island. So interesting. Basically, as soon as we had the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as soon as we got into the Cold War, as soon as we had the missile race, and all of that, proliferation of nuclear missiles and the nuclear power plants and all that, we started to have science fiction that was dealing with atomic war, nuclear accidents, the aftermath of a nuclear war, and all of that. Now in Things to Come, the great movie by H.G. Wells, we have a regular war reduce mankind to barbarism, but that wasn't. Nuclear war was actually the first time that we really could destroy humanity, destroy most of the life on Earth. And so science fiction writers, of course, it became a subgenre of science fiction. And also, interestingly enough, there would be mainstream fiction that was written about that subject too, but not marketed as science fiction. And movies were made of those subjects, and some were science fiction movies and some were perceived not as being science fiction movies, despite the fact they were dealing with a future event. So basically, but what all this led me to doing this commentary about, what brought it about, was Chernobyl on the one hand, but then I was cruising around Amazon Prime, and there was a show that was available for me to watch called Atomic Attack. Now, Atomic Attack was made in the early 50s. It was a live TV show. I think it's on Westinghouse Playhouse. Back then, shows were named after their sponsor. So you had, every major sponsor would be, and that came off of radio too. The Jello program with Jack Benny, Okay. So, but this was an hour-long TV drama, live TV drama. It was in kinescope. They used to put a camera at a high-resolution monitor, black and white monitor, and film the live broadcast, because first of all they would then show it 3 hours later. They do a wet processing of the film so that they could show it 3 hours later for the West Coast, because this was a live broadcast out of New York. And then the kinescopes would sometimes be syndicated or not, and depending on the show. But they're called kinescopes, but they're actually 16 millimeter films of live dramas, and in many cases that's the only record. Usually that's the only record we have of a live TV show, because black and white videotape didn't exist yet in the early 50s. So so Atomic Attack. It was set in New York State, and it was about a family when there's a nuclear war. And the idea is that Russia has attacked us. We've retaliated, and the question is this woman's husband dead? It's how we deal with fallout. It's how we deal with the deaths of our families. It's a really interesting show, and it's about civil defense and listening to civil defense, and it's a little more optimistic than we would ultimately present this kind of fiction, but it's very interesting to watch. And then at the credit roll at the end, I was very surprised. Because, well, first of all, Herbert Brodkin was one of the people involved with it. He became a major person in live television, but also it was based on a novel by Judith Merril. And so I went on eBay, thank God for eBay, and I ordered this book, Shadow on the Hearth by Judith Merril. Now, for those of you who know 50s and 60s science fiction, Judith Merril was one of the renowned science fiction writers and anthologists. And she would do a best of the year anthology. And I would always read her anthologies and Terry Carr's and Donald A. Wollheim's. And I could always understand the stories in Donald A. Wollheim's and Terry Carr's, but Judith Merril's stories, she was publishing things by Carol Emshwiller, the wife of the illustrator Ed Emshwiller, and I could never understand any of the stories. They were always so oblique and so artsy that I could, as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old reading them, it was like, what was that about? Probably if I read them now, I would understand some of them. But Judith Merril, but this is a novel, and I never read any of the novels she wrote. So I ordered this, and it's about a family surviving a nuclear war. And many of these people, Judith Merril, I read many of their books. They were like sort of the pantheon of gods to me. And she was married to Frederick Pohl, who was also an editor and a science fiction agent and a noted anthologist and novelist himself. He wrote a novel called Chernobyl that was about the Chernobyl accident, but theorizing what might have happened. It was a fictional novel, and because back then they weren't public about what happened, and other than there had been a meltdown, and because they couldn't hide that because of the radiation circling the world. But many of these people I read and had no idea what they looked like. But then here's Judith Merril. There she is. That's what she looked like. So kind of cool to finally see who these people are and what they look like. And so I have the novel now. I've started reading it, and very interesting. But then there were a lot of science fiction novels dealing with atomic war. Fahrenheit 451 has an atomic war in it, as does the Martian Chronicles. And one of the great after the bomb stories is A Canticle for Leibowitz. This is the first edition, and you can sort of see what it looked like, and a very cool cover, and it's a great novel, a great novel, and then but basically almost every science fiction writer had his or her go at writing an after the bomb story. So this is Rebirth by John Wyndham. This is the British. This is the American hardcover first edition. It was also done as a British book under the title The Chrysalids, and but basically everyone, Lee Brackett, everyone was more or less doing their after the bomb stories, and that kind of story has faded from the scene in terms of science fiction, and we went into other dystopic predictions. Global warming is much more the common one now, including in Space Command we have global warming, but the threat of nuclear annihilation still is over our heads, but it's much more covert now, and I don't think there'd be the worldwide conflagration that under the Cold War was a distinct possibility, and we came the closest to it with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But fortunately, we averted a nuclear war thanks to Kennedy and Khrushchev, thank God, and wiser heads prevailed, and we didn't all die, thank God. But we certainly could have. So, but again, there were mainstream novels like On the Beach, which was a novel by Neville Shute about the aftermath of a nuclear war, and it's a very good novel, and which I've read, and also it was made into a good movie with Gregory Peck and all these American actors trying to play Australians to Fred Astaire, Ava Gardner, to varying degrees of believability. This is before actors really knew how to do Australian accents, but fascinatingly, so you would have those as mainstream novels, or Red Alert, which is about a potential nuclear war, or Dr. Strangelove, both the book. There was a book and a movie. The movie's great. The book, we can get into the history of that when we do the history of science fiction movies. But Dr. Strangelove is a great movie dealing with the nuclear war, and but then there were science fiction movies that were dealing, and novels that were dealing with after the bomb or the bomb or atomic energy creating gigantic praying mantises and so forth, or gigantic ants. And we'll get into that again when we do this, the history of science fiction. But just for now, again, circling back to my initial point, watch Chernobyl. You'll find it very interesting and horrific. By the way, the thing that really affected the arms race, the nuclear arms race, was when Nicholas Meyer did The Day After, which was this TV movie that dealt with a nuclear war and the aftermath, and it was extremely horrific. Carl Sagan started talking about nuclear winter, and that began to proliferate. There were TV shows done in England as well, and movies done like Testament. But the one that really had teeth was The Day After. It had Jason Robards in it, and that was seen by the leaders here, Reagan and Congress, and Mikhail Gorbachev watched it, and all of them had the same response, which was, we must never let this happen. And that's what really started arms control in earnest, where they were really saying we cannot have this happen to our world, and they saw the larger issue, which was we're all human, and we must not wipe out our race. We must not deed this to our children and grandchildren, and so television and science fiction and all of this stuff can have a very positive effect on the world. And so watch Chernobyl, and next time you see a nuclear power plant, think about it and think about, do we really want nuclear power? And again, some people are in favor of nuclear power. I personally am not. I'm very much in favor of renewable energy. I mean, my God, we live under the sun, and it's a huge, thermonuclear reactor, a fusion reactor, and we can make it do a lot more for us than it does, and there's wind power and all of this stuff, and so I think we should maximize all of that, and that doesn't mean there aren't other forms of power, but I think we could really make the world a lot better by looking toward wind and geothermal and solar a lot more. But that's just me. That's just me. And if you love nuclear power plants, more power to you, but watch Chernobyl and see, what can happen. And I know there's the arguments about, well, that was a very badly designed nuclear reactor. Nuclear power is clean power. And so, okay, fine. And coal, clean coal, so to speak, and fossil fuels and all of that. But, and that's a conversation we could have. But again, my goal is not to polarize. My goal is to say, live and let live, and people can have different opinions. But I'll just tell you mine. Uh, but um, but finally, I'm really glad we didn't have a nuclear war. Watch Chernobyl, but go back and watch Atomic Attack. It's really interesting. See, the thing I love about live television, and also radio for that matter, is it's like an insect in amber, because movies show you the world in a certain way, but it's a very polished art form. You're shooting each angle, each take, is it's assembled. Whereas live TV has an immediacy. You really get a sense of what people thought and were like back then. And radio is the same way because it went out live by and large. And so it has an immediacy and it's like a moment caught in amber and frozen in time. And so watch Atomic Attack. You'll find it very interesting to see what what thought was back then, and it was actually more interesting than I thought it would be, and I liked it. And then of course Rod Serling went on to do these great cautionary tales on Twilight Zone, like Time and If It Last, and so forth, where he showed nuclear disaster, and it was very powerful, and it framed the viewpoints of a generation of kids who were watching that and then grew up to be hippies and so forth. So it had a tremendous effect on creating the next generation. So that's it for now, Mr. Sci-Fi. But thank God we all live in these times, and kiss your kids, tell people you love them, and we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.